Welcome to part 2 of chapter 17, where we're going to be talking about the long run responses to shocks in the new Keynesian model. Now, in the last lecture, we talked about the short to medium run responses in the new Keynesian model. This time, we're going to be talking about the long run responses to those shocks. And there's 3 shocks in particular we're going to be looking at. There's the monetary policy shock, the fiscal policy shock, and then the technology shock. Now, we already sort of know what these are going to end up looking like. So if you look at the real business cycle model, that's where these long-run responses are going to go to. So we know where we're going to end up. We just need to know how we're going to get there. So which one are we going to start with? Well, we're going to start with a monetary policy shock. Why? Because monetary policy is cool. Now, this is the short to medium run response. So this is the stuff that you learned in the last lecture. We can go through a quick little aside on this just to make sure that, we're all on the same page here, which is page 4 out of 29. What happened? Well, if you remember, we started with this pink LM curve. Now, when there was an injection of money, there was a monetary injection, a monetary stimulus. Initially, because there's an increase in the money supply, because remember the LM curve is a function of prices in money. With an increase in the money supply, it drags the LM curve all the way out to this blue curve here, LM of P0 and M1. Now, as the LM curve moves out all the way to this amount, it drags the aggregate demand curve out by an equal horizontal amount. Now, in the event that we could have totally sticky prices, we'd have a super flat short-run aggregate supply curve, and output would be all the way over here where we'd like it. However, that's not the case because short-run aggregate supply is upward sloping. It's not flat. Now, there are cases where it's flat when prices are totally sticky. But remember, the slope of the short-run aggregate supply curve is a function of how sticky prices are. The stickier the prices are, the flatter the short-run aggregate supply curve is. So we'd like to be here for output, but we got to be where the orange dotted line is because that's where aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply are intersecting with each other. So we hike on up over to this little equilibrium point here, and as we move up there, right, prices are increasing because we've got P0 being equal to the expected price level. We're going to move up to P1. Now, as the price level increases, the LM curve shifts inward. So as far as what the LM curve is doing, it's like a yo-yo, right? We drop it, goes all the way down, and then it starts to come back up a little bit. Now, it comes back up to the point where short-run aggregate supply and aggregate demand intersect, and that's our new intermediate price level. And then from here, you can see initially the interest rate dropped, and it pops up just a little bit, and it settles, at least for the short run, at R2. And then we trace all the way down, over and up, and we get a labor demand shock, increasing employment, and real wages. So this is the short run response to shocks in the new Keynesian model. But in the long run, all the prices are going to adjust. So that means that the LM curve is going to be shifting backwards, back to where it was originally. So what it does is like I said, initially it goes out to the blue, comes back into the orange, and now what it did is it shifted in, again, if you look, LM0 equals LM3. Well, LM1 is the initial, shock, and then it comes into LM2, and then it goes to LM3. So it's a yo-yo. You drop it, and eventually it comes all the way back up. Now, as it comes back up, what happens is we move from the equilibrium here of aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply. We're going to be moving over to where short-run aggregate supply, aggregate demand, and long-run aggregate supply are equal to each other. So what happens there? Well, we have to maintain that equilibrium. So the short-run aggregate supply curve shifts in. The short-run aggregate supply curve will shift as prices can be updated. So as more firms can update their prices, it shifts. Don't get that confused with the slope. The slope is the share of firms that can update their prices at any one point in time. However, as all firms can eventually update their prices, the short-run aggregate supply curve will eventually shift. So what's happening is these firms are getting smarter, and they're setting a higher price level so that they don't get bamboozled again in the future, right? Like, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. They don't want to get fooled twice. So they update their prices, and short-run aggregate supply shifts up. It shifts up to the point where we now have a new expected price level, which is the intersection of short-run and long-run aggregate supply with aggregate demand. So anytime you have short-run and long-run aggregate supply intersecting, and we have aggregate demand intersecting at that point as well, that gives us our expected price level. Then we trace down, over, and up, and you can see now we are at the initial point, or the initial equilibrium point in the labor markets. So, because we're at that new equilibrium of short-run aggregate supply 1 equals long-run aggregate supply equals aggregate demand 1, output returned to where it was before, and the labor demand curve is going to shift back to where it was before the shock. So this is now WT2 because, well, it was W0, W1 when it increased, and now it's back to, well, W0, but we're going to call it W2. And then labor drops as well back to where it was. So in the long run, the only thing that is affected is the price level because the real interest rate fell and then it went right back up to where it was. Output increased, went right back down to where it was. Hours worked, labor increased, went back to where it was. The real wage increased, went right back to where it was. So we just saw monetary neutrality. So monetary neutrality still holds in the new Keynesian model. It just makes an argument that there's an intermediate process, an intermediate step, a couple of steps really, in which there's an adjustment from the initial shock to convergence towards like a long-run equilibrium. Now, we're going to do the same thing with an IS curve shock now. This is where we start out. So you remember with the IS curve shock, instead of the LM curve moving first, the IS curve moves first. So we go from the blue to the orange. And again, as the IS curve shifts out, it drags aggregate demand out horizontally with it. Okay, cool. Well, again, we'd like to have output here, but we can't. So we got to drag up a little bit, which then pulls the LM curve up. Because as prices increase, the LM curve shifts in, right? So we have a higher real interest rate than where we were. R2 is higher than R0. Higher interest rate, higher price level, but trace that down, over, and up, and we get this shock to labor demand with an increase in real wages and employment. So the first thing that happens, just like with the monetary policy shock, is that now all firms get to update their prices. So in the long run, remember, the share of firms that can update their prices approaches 1. So the short-run aggregate supply curve shifts inwards. So the price level increases from P1 up to P2, which is now equal to the new expected price level. So the short-run aggregate supply curve shifts in again, and we get a new higher price level. But our equilibrium is now here. It was here, now it's here. But if we were to draw up, oh God, there's no LM curve up here. And the LM curve would have to be right where this little cursor is. Can't be anywhere else. So what happens? Well, the LM curve has to shift in. So that LM curve shifts in because, remember, prices are increasing. So if prices increase, the LM curve shifts in, which means we have a new interest rate of RT3, which is higher than where we were before the shock. So interest rate increases, increases, and increases again. Now with this interest rate, we are now in an equilibrium. So we have to trace down, over, and up, and that leaves us back to where we were, bless me, prior to the shock. So in the long run here, when it comes to a government spending shock, the long run leaves us with a higher real interest rate and higher prices, and then nothing else is affected. So finally, that labor demand curve has to shift back in. I guess I got a little ahead of myself there. Don't judge me. I'm a little sick, in case you haven't noticed. So the labor demand curve shifts back in, back to where it was. So now the new wage is equal to the old wage. I should probably be muting myself for that, but I'm kind of sick and I can't. Well, I can, but not really feeling it. So we're going to have to let it slide today. All right, now this is where I lied a little bit. I want you to work on the total factor productivity shock by yourselves. See if you can figure out what has to happen here. Now, I'll give you a couple of hints. The first is that the aggregate response or the aggregate supply response in the new Keynesian model was muted because only some of the firms could change their prices. So if all the firms can change their prices, what happens to the short-run aggregate supply curve? Then ask yourself, what happens to the price level? Because if the short-run aggregate supply curve is moving, well, that means that the equilibrium in the aggregate supply, aggregate demand space is going to be moving. It's going to be changing. If that equilibrium changes, the price level is likely going to change. What happens? And then if the price level changes, what happens to the LM curve? Once that equilibrium gets determined, what happens to labor demand? And then what happens to wages? And the final hint is that it should look just like the real business cycle model's response at the end. So you know where you're going to be ending up. You just got to figure out exactly how you're going to get there. So, got a couple of concluding thoughts here. For each shock that we covered, the long-run response is equal to the predictions given by the real business cycle model. There's just some intermediate steps. This is something that's known as the neoclassical synthesis. And the idea with the neoclassical synthesis is that in the crudest way possible, shit happens in the short run, but not in the long run. So there's this really funny video. I got to find it. Maybe share it. The instant I am no longer your teacher. There is this guy, he calls himself a stand-up economist, like a stand-up comedian who tells jokes about economics. It's really funny to a very select subset of people. I happen to be in that group. And there's this whole thing like with this like shit happens school of economic thought. And it's like for different schools, it's shit happens in a different way. So like for Keynesian economics, the shit happens thing is like this shit is sticky because, you know, like sticky prices and all that stuff. In the neoclassical synthesis, he said shit happens in the short run, but it doesn't happen in the long run. And basically I hate to say it, but it's actually pretty true the way that one works, because you do get some real economic responses to policy interventions in the short run. But in the long run, basically everybody wises up, everybody is able to respond accordingly, and then the economy sort of returns to the state that it was in prior to the shock. So let's talk a little bit more about the monetary policy shocks in the next slide. And here we are, the next slide. So for the monetary policy shock, we can see that monetary neutrality holds in the long run, just like the real business cycle model predicted. So in response to that monetary policy shock, we can see that real variables aren't going to be affected in the long run. So variables like output, real wages, labor, and the real interest rate all remain totally unaffected. Now, the prices, money supply, and the nominal interest rate, which is implicitly given, does move. Additionally, the nominal wage rate moves. How does the nominal wage rate move? Well, let's take a look. Go back to the monetary policy stuff. Here we are, monetary policy. So if you look, the real wage increased, but then it fell. So you're like, okay, well, the real wage increased, and then the real wage falls. How is it the case that the real wage falls and the nominal wage doesn't fall? Well, what happens is that the real wage falls because the price level increases. So if the nominal wage increases, and then the price level increases again, the nominal wage remains the same, may even be higher. But the real wage, the purchasing power of that wage, falls because the price level rose and the nominal wage didn't rise with it. Hence, the real wage is going to be falling. So, in response to a monetary policy shock in the long run, the nominal variables all move. but the real variables don't. So the nominal variables being, price, the nominal interest rate, the nominal wage rate, those things can move still, but the real variables, the things that actually matter, are totally unaffected. But where the new Keynesian model differs pretty substantially from the real business cycle model is that the new Keynesian model has an intermediate adjustment phase that gets illustrated, where the real interest rate falls, output labor and real wages increase in the short to medium run, and then they kind of converge to the predictions of the real business cycle model in the long run. So if you drew out the shocks in the real business cycle model, you would get the same results as the long run stuff in the new Keynesian model. However, if you look at the new Keynesian model, you're going to have a lot of other curves drawn in there in the intermediate process. It's kind of how we get to that long run equilibrium. So then the question is, why can't the central bank just constantly inflate the money supply and just keep output above that long run flexible price equilibrium for an indefinite amount of time? The answer, there are limits to monetary expansion. And monetary expansion isn't costless. It'd be nice if it was costless, but there are significant costs to monetary expansion. And those costs are inflation. They can enjoy higher output, but they have to be able to tolerate higher inflation in order to get that higher output. Because eventually all the firms can change their prices, which means they're going to settle in at a higher price level than before. So if the central bank were to inflate again, everybody's used to that higher price level. Prices would increase even further, which then increases inflation even more. And remember, firms can only update their prices every so often. So in the time periods that they can't update their prices, they're really running at a loss, right? So when they get to update their prices, they're going to update their prices in a way that makes sure they kind of make up for that loss in a sense. Which means if there's a monetary policy shock again, well, they're going to update their prices and settle in at a even higher price level than where they were before because they know they're just going to get screwed again. So the more the central bank tries to inflate, the more the central bank tries to expand the money supply, the more firms are going to wise up to it and update their prices whenever they can and give us an even higher and higher and higher price level. And as the price level continues to increase more and more and more, inflation accelerates. Now, this is actually something that we saw in the 1970s as the culmination of the Federal Reserve's attempts to try to use monetary policy to inflate us into prosperity. Now, there were other problems as well in the 1970s. There's that huge oil price shock. Things weren't really all that great in the 1970s, but throughout a majority of that decade, we actually had something known as stagflation, where we had stagnant economic growth and high inflation. Typically, you tend to see, if you have some high inflation, you'll generally see a little bit of economic growth associated with it. There's this thing called the Phillips curve that we've gone over that explains that trade-off between inflation and unemployment or inflation and output. Now, in the event that the Phillips curve no longer holds anymore, you end up with something known as stagflation because you'll have high inflation, but you'll have really slow or sometimes no economic growth. So it's not like this is something that has never been tried before. It's been tried. It's been tried and tried and tried and even tried some more. And every single time we end up with the same result. High inflation, economic growth isn't all that great. If you actually look at, where we've been for the last year or so, this is being recorded in November of 2023, and it's really been about the last probably 2.5 years that we've been experiencing pretty high inflation. It spiked in mid-2022. It's on its way down as of now. I believe it's somewhere in the 3% range as it was last reported. But that's all because of rampant monetary expansion. I don't know why my brain froze there for a second. It probably got something to do with me being sick. But that rampant monetary expansion that we saw in response to the COVID-19 pandemic and the central bank just continuing their asset purchases over and over and over all through 2021 when they really had no business doing so, past then, 2022 even, and they eventually began to wind those down and then try to raise their policy rate. But unfortunately, they expanded for way too long, and we ended up with the high inflation scenario that we've been in ever since. Okay, so enough of a rant there. Why can't they affect output, right? If they can just inflate and inflate and inflate and increase the money supply, why isn't that going to be changing output in the long run? It'll change it in the short run. We saw the mechanisms via which it changes it in the short run, but why can't it do anything about the long run? And it's because changing the money supply doesn't change the productivity in the firm's production technology. It doesn't change that total factor productivity term. Right? If you increase the number of dollars that's circulating, it's not giving me any new ideas because these two shocks are orthogonal to one another. A monetary policy shock is uncorrelated with a total factor productivity shock. So an increase to the money supply isn't going to give anybody new ideas to make things in a new way because money and technology aren't the same thing. There's no movement in the long-run aggregate supply curve in response to a monetary policy shock because the underlying technology behind that economy's productivity in the aggregate isn't being changed by changes in the money supply. So you get no permanent movement in output. Well, what about fiscal policy? This is where we get to have fun. Fiscal policy doesn't change the firm's production technology either, even though some lawmakers may try to tell you otherwise. And there's that whole joke, I believe it's from Mark Twain, and it's funny. This is actually the second time I'm recording this video because the first time apparently something was really screwed up and it was missing like the first 5 minutes worth of audio. And, well, I'm a little sick and kind of out of it. And I guess I forgot to change this one line here. And it's that politicians are just like diapers. They should be changed frequently and for the same reasons. Now, like I said, you'll get some lawmakers that try to tell you otherwise. Oh, we spent all this money and, because of, our intervention into the economy, they'll word it other ways, of course. But it boils down to our intervention with the economy has saved the world and it's, allowed for this new company to come in and set up shop and start producing stuff. And that, increases prosperity for your average American and blah, 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 all that bullshit. Here's the thing. Okay, they paid for a plant in their new, in their city, their district, whatever, or even in their country. They've tried to import something. They've offered tax benefits for some company that already got the idea, that's already been producing these things, to come into their country, their district, what have you, and set up shop there and start producing. But their spending didn't give anybody new ideas, right? That fiscal policy of either getting a tax break or some other incentive to come in and set up shop isn't giving you new ideas. It's just giving you a place to make that stuff. You could have made it literally anywhere else that you wanted to, and you decided to do it there instead. So when the government spends their money, we are invariably going to end up with higher interest rates because they're not really spending their money. They're spending your money because the government isn't producing anything. And if you want to get like, I can't believe, there's some crazy libertarian. Well, look at the production function. Government's not in the production function. So they're not producing anything. So the only way they can get money is by literally sifting it off of like everybody else. So they got to borrow it. When they borrow it, you get higher interest rates. So if the government's spending the money, well, you get higher interest rates, higher prices. That's not necessarily favorable. So you can see government spending shocks aren't costless either. So now you're probably going like, all right, well, if we have these two policy shocks and they're so bad, why does anybody use them? The answer for that is fairly straightforward, actually. And it's that because sometimes not using them isn't costless either. Sometimes it's worse to not use them. There are times where well-timed monetary or fiscal policy responses are absolutely appropriate and may not necessarily increase economic activity. They can at least stop economic activity from falling more than it would in its absence. So if output falls, unemployment increases, A lack of action could mean that politicians lose their election whenever they're up for re-election. Plus, sometimes policy just is necessary. The 2008 financial crisis, there was some policy intervention there. In the 2020 COVID outbreak, there was policy intervention there. It was necessary in both of those cases. Now, the extent to which it was used, okay, its necessity and its usefulness there is maybe up for debate. But the fact that it was necessary economically and definitely politically can't be debated. So there's a trade-off. You can either do the thing and face higher prices or higher interest rates, or you can not do the thing, maybe make things worse and possibly even lose re-election. A politician never wants to lose their seat. Now, sadly, we'll never really know the true counterfactual. And the counterfactual is what we would have had in the absence of said policy. So let's say there's an alternate universe where COVID breaks out and the government doesn't start giving out stimmies or start, rampantly printing money trying to copy what they did in 2008. Or, in this other alternate universe, let's say we hit the financial crisis of 2008 and the Federal Reserve doesn't engage in quantitative easing. We'll never know what happened there. Now, we can try to estimate a counterfactual using like fancy econometrics and all that, but we don't actually know what would have happened otherwise. We can really just get a semi-educated guess there. So, long story short on this slide, it's sometimes politically expedient to engage in these policies, even if they can be harmful to the economy overall, at least for the politician. And then there are times where we do need some of these policies. So it's not like it's this, always, terrible policy that they're engaging in. Monetary policy interventions are sometimes necessary, as are fiscal policy. Now, there's the argument that monetary policy shocks explain more variance in some of the real economic variables in the short run than like fiscal policy shocks do, things like that. But we're not going to get into that. More stuff. This is kind of getting back to the new Keynesian model. So it's the end of my rant, and it's getting a little bit more in line with the actual theoretical model that we've been learning about. In the new Keynesian model, output's demand determined, which means that demand plays some role in the equilibrium level of output. So if there's a shock that moves demand, it's a demand side shock, then that can affect output, at least in the short to medium run. So demand side policy, things like fiscal and monetary policy shocks, can impact real variables in the short to medium run because output is demand determined in the new Keynesian model. And the elasticity of demand can play a huge role in how responsive equilibrium output is to these shocks. So maybe try it on your own, right? Draw out the shocks, demand's relatively inelastic and relatively elastic. See which one has a larger response in output. And then try the same thing with aggregate supply. So I said the elasticity of demand can play a role. See what also happens with the elasticity of supply. When prices are totally sticky, see what happens. When prices are totally responsive, see what happens. Now, when they're totally responsive, you already know what happens there. It's the real business cycle model. So see what happens when the short-run aggregate supply curve is totally flat. More stuff to remember. The LM curve shifts out if the central bank increases the money supply. The LM curve is going to shift in when the price level increases. The LM curve is only going to shift aggregate demand if the money supply changes. If the price level increases, it's not going to be shifting aggregate demand because aggregate demand is already a function of prices. So if not that many prices can increase, the LM curve shifts in by a lot. If a lot of prices... it shifts in by a lot less, not it shifts in by a lot. Sorry, as I was saying that, I'm like, that doesn't sound right. Helps to read. So if not that many prices can increase, the LM curve doesn't shift in a lot. If a lot of prices can increase, the LM curve shifts in by a lot. Now, as we go to the long run, the S short run aggregate supply curve shifts inward. The LM curve shifts inward as well. And if there was a shock, remember, right after that shock, aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply are equal to each other in the short run. And following that shock in the long run, aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply equal long-run aggregate supply. So in the short run, we can increase output a little bit, which reduces unemployment and increases prices by just a little bit. It's beneficial in the case of a recession, right? If you think over the course of a business cycle, the new Keynesian model can really sort of mute out the lowest of the lows in the business cycle. But it comes at a cost because, well, we're going to end up with higher prices. If we're looking at monetary policy, if we're looking at fiscal policy, we're going to end up with higher prices and higher interest rates. And as prices can adjust more, firms get to update their prices. They set their prices expecting higher inflation in the future, which means even higher prices and then higher prices and higher prices in the future every time they respond to an additional monetary policy shock. And every time prices get to increase, the short-run aggregate supply curve shifts inwards, which then increases the expected price level up until the point that short-run and long-run aggregate supply are equal, and they both equal aggregate demand. And then we return to our natural rates of output and employment and all that good stuff. And that is the end of this lecture. So thank you for watching. There's going to be another lecture coming up shortly, and that will be looking at like some of the empirical tests of the new Keynesian and real business cycle models. So thanks for watching, and you got another video coming up very, very soon. Thank you. Bye.